Welcome to this further evidence session of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee as part of our inquiry into disinformation and fake news. I'd like to welcome Christopher Wylie and Paul Olivier de Hay to the committee to give evidence this morning. Before we start the committee session, I would just like to give an update on the invitation of the Select Committee to Mark Zuckerberg to give evidence before us. We believe, given the serious nature of the allegations that have been made around the access and use of Facebook user data, that it is appropriate that Mark Zuckerberg should give evidence to the committee. He has suggested that Chris Cox, the Chief Product Officer at Facebook, could come to London to give evidence to the committee in the first week after the Easter recess. So we'll be very happy to invite Mr. Cox to give evidence. However, we would still like to hear from Mr. Zuckerberg as well. We will seek to clarify with Facebook whether he is available to give evidence or not, because that wasn't clear from our correspondence. And if he is available to give evidence, then we will be happy to do that either in person or by video link, if that would be more convenient for him. If there are any, happy to answer any further questions about that after the hearing, but that is all we'd like to say on that at this time. We turn now to the evidence session this morning. If I could ask Chris Wylie first. As you know, a lot of the committee's work over the last few weeks has been looking at the role of Cambridge Analytica in the data analytics business and their campaigns, and we heard evidence from Alexander Nix a few weeks ago. Perhaps you could, for the benefit of the committee and the record, just explain how you first became involved with Alexander Nix and Cambridge Analytica.
Sure. So I first joined SCL Group, which is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, actually before Cambridge Analytica existed, in June 2013. I got introduced to him through a mutual contact that I had worked with previously in UK politics. The firm SCL had an opening for a research director, in part because the past research director died in his hotel room in Kenya when he was working for Uhuru Kenyatta. I didn't know that at the time. Part of the reason why I got chosen to become research director is because the firm was looking to expand its digital capacity and sort of keep up with developments that were happening, particularly on the military side, looking at how information spreads online and developing new IP that they could then, pass on to clients, whether that's political or military. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And could you just talk again for the record, just explain how long you worked at and with Cambridge Analytica and what caused you to leave the company?
Sure. So when I started in June 2013, Cambridge Analytica didn't exist yet. So and it's important for people to understand that Cambridge Analytica is more of a concept or a brand than anything else, because it doesn't actually have employees. It's all SCL. It's just the front-facing company for the United States. But I started at SCL Group in June 2013. In July 2014, that's when I told Alexander Nix that I didn't want to continue working at the time Cambridge Analytica. Although I scaled down my work until the 2014 midterms, so a year and a half. Cambridge Analytica, just to be clear, was set up in large part because of the research that I was doing at SCL Group. So it was the IP that we were creating was acquired by Robert Mercer, and Cambridge Analytica became the vehicle to sort of acquire that IP.
Yeah. How would you said that Cambridge Analytica doesn't have any employees, that effectively they're all employed by SCL.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you characterise the relationship between these different companies? I mean, is it in effect one organisation that exists behind different facades?
Yeah, I mean, so Cambridge Analytica was set up in part because, first of all, there was, so the way it works is CA was set up, and SCL Elections, which is part of SCL Group, which is a group company. SCL Elections became a minority shareholder, and then Robert Mercer became the majority shareholder of Cambridge Analytica. SCL then assigned its intellectual property to Cambridge Analytica, and then Cambridge Analytica licensed back the IP to SCL Elections, and then also granted SCL Elections an exclusivity contract whereby all projects from Cambridge Analytica would be given to SCL to work on, although the actual contracting on the client-facing side would be with Cambridge Analytica. Partly that was because in the United States there's particular rules against foreign actors in elections, so having an American company was beneficial for that purpose. Also, Robert Mercer's lawyers were concerned about two things. Firstly, the optics of acquiring a UK military contractor to work in American elections. Optically, that wouldn't necessarily play well. And secondly, they were concerned about some of the history of the shareholders in the company, as well as some of the past projects they had worked on.
The company being SCL? No,
SCL,
yeah. So Cambridge Analytica was a kind of a company set up with the purpose of doing political work in America? In
the United States, with a new brand that was sort of untainted by any history or legacy of past projects or shareholders.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will say, and are saying, that given that you're someone who worked very closely with these people for a period of time and understand this world very well and have built your career working in it, why have you decided to speak out against it and give evidence against people who used to be your colleagues?
Because, as a citizen, one is expected and has a duty to report unlawful activity. In terms of if you're asking about sort of my journey to this moment, a lot of people have asked me, why is it taking you so long? What they don't see is that actually I've been working on this with The Guardian and then later the New York Times and Channel 4 for a year. So what you're seeing is sort of the apex or the climax of that. But this is a year-long coming out process. But before going public, I went and started working with the ICO and UK authorities to start their investigation. After I left Cambridge Analytica, very shortly after that, I got threatened with legal action and had, a very aggressive team of lawyers coming after me. So I signed an undertaking of confidentiality, which would mean that if I did break that, I could be sued into oblivion by Robert Mercer. So frankly, that's intimidating. But more broadly, it was only until 2016 when I was working at CA and setting it up. You don't appreciate the future impact of what your work is until it starts to happen. And so 2016 was where I started looking at what this company was actually doing in the United States, and coming to appreciate that the projects that I was working on may have had a much wider impact than I initially anticipated it would. And after Donald Trump got inaugurated, very shortly after that, that's when I started working with Carol at The Guardian on reporting some of the things that the company was doing. So for the spring, I was one of her key sources anonymously until we could figure out a legal position that would then allow me to come forward.
So you, it'd be fair to say that for you, Donald Trump's election sort of crossed a line. You felt that techniques that you were aware of had been used, shouldn't have been used in the way they were used during the campaign, and therefore you felt that you felt you had to speak out about it? Would that be a way of characterizing it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just because of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump kind of makes it click in your head that this actually has a much wider impact. I don't think that military-style information operations is conducive for any democratic process, whether it's a U.S. presidential or a local council race.
Yeah. Could I ask as well about the relation when Cambridge Analytica was founded? I mean, who do you think sort of, in terms of how the algorithm, the database that Cambridge Analytica worked from, was that something it inherited from SCL, or was that something that you developed, or was it developed by other people?
No, SCL. This is partly why I was brought on as research director, because SCL was falling behind in its technical capacity and in its quantitative, skill set. So it didn't. SCL. Before I joined, did not have any data assets. So that was in large part why I got hired. So it was the Ripon project that actually scaled, acquired, data and scaled it. It was at that moment where they started becoming more focused on data science and machine learning.
Well, is it true? I've seen it reported that the name Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon's. Is that correct?
Yeah, because it's sort of a bizarre story. So Alexander Nix has his sort of standard pitch, as it were, and it often relies heavily on, we have offices in Mayfair, and I went to Eton, and, presenting a very sort of posh veneer onto the company, which, when you look at their clientele in a lot of the, it's a lot of developing countries in the Commonwealth, and there's still sort of that sort of image, plays well with certain types of clients that he had worked with in the past. Problem was that for Steve Bannon, he didn't really care about that. He was much more interested in, going and speaking at student events at Cambridge than, sitting in a posh office in Mayfair. So Alexander realized that, and he decided to set up a fake office in Cambridge so that whenever Steve Bannon, this is before Steve Bannon came on board to which, set up a project which eventually became CA. And so whenever Bannon would come, we set up this fake office, and to sort of present a more academic side of the company. And it was from that Steve Bannon decided we should call it Cambridge Analytica because of how closely associated it was with the university. Because in his head, it was a very academic company. Okay.
And other than that geographical proximity, did the company have any particular relationship with Cambridge University?
It didn't have a formal relationship, but we did work with a lot of professors at the University of Cambridge, in particular the psychology department and the psychometric center.
Okay, so they would do research projects and assist with developing techniques and feeding ideas.
Yeah. We would use the Cambridge has an amazing psychology department. It's one of the top, if not the top, in the world for psychology. So. It was a real resource to have that very close to us. So we did work with several professors at the psychology department on developing psychometric inventories, and also looking more broadly at the research that was coming out of the university in psychological profiling using online data exhaust. So, a lot of the papers that eventually became the foundation of the methods that were then used on the Ripon project, that all came out of research that was being done at the University of Cambridge, some of which was funded in part by DARPA, for example, which is the US military's research agency.
And did you just approach academics on an ad hoc basis, or was there any engagement with the university authorities or any of the departments?
We definitely talked to some of the more senior professors, but it was all, there was nothing formalized with the university itself. Mm-hmm. So it was all done, professor to professor to professor, but it sort of sat in a gray area. I mean, when Rip-On was happening, we had a lot of people who we were engaging at Cambridge who provided, who played a pivotal role in actually getting that project going.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. So essentially your central motivation has been that you're rather aghast that techniques in the social media world that have been used for military psyops purposes are being used in the political domain.
I mean, that's a part of it. I think also more broadly, when you look at how Cambridge Analytica operates or how SCL operates, they don't care whether or not what they do is legal as long as it gets the job done. So it's not, there's been a lot of focus on the data side of things, and there's been a lot of focus on targeting, but more broadly, this is a company that goes around the world and undermines civic institutions of countries that are struggling to develop those institutions. So there's a lot of reasons why I find the company problematic. It's not just the data. It's also more broadly that they are an example of what modern day colonialism looks like. You have a wealthy company from a developed nation going into an economy or a democracy that's still struggling to get its feet on the ground, and taking advantage of that to profit from that. So there's several reasons why I find the company problematic.
So do they sort of like to have an aura, do you think, of being the schmash of the modern digital age?
The smash?
Schmash. It's a James Bond, the evil organisation that manipulates things here, there, and everywhere across the world.
I think if you watch the Channel 4 Undercover, for example, I think you can see for yourself that they know that that's the brand that they present, and they cultivate that. I think they find it amusing.
No, I sort of get it, and I didn't quite know what to make of Mr. Nix when he came to us, apart from that he was a corporate financier who sought sort of a higher calling, as he almost said it to us. But I do remember on the Channel 4, one of the most hilarious bits was a chap called Mark Turnbull, who got a big plaster on his nose, I think, saying that he was a master of disguise.
He doesn't always have the plaster on his nose.
Okay. There's just before we want to get around onto some of the things that happen in different parts of the world, but just before we do, I just wanted to just probe into your predecessor who died in Kenya.
Yeah.
Was that? I've not heard of that. Working for the Kenyatta campaign.
Yeah.
Were there any suspicious circumstances?
I've heard several different stories as to what actually happened, so I don't know which story is accurate, but it didn't sound. When you work in Kenyan politics or politics in a lot of African countries, if a deal goes wrong, you can pay for it.
So is this a matter of public record, or is this new now?
Dan, who's my predecessor, his death did cause some news coverage in Romania because he was the son of a cabinet minister in Romania who is now in jail for corruption charges, I think. But so he came from a political family in Romania. So the fact that he died was news, but the circumstances of his death, I've heard different stories, so I'm not sure which is.
And his name was Dan?
Dan, his surname starts with an M. And
Muresan.
Yeah,
Dan
Muresan.
Muresan.
Could you spell that just for the record?
M-U-R-E-S-A-N.
Okay.
He was working simultaneously in India, I think, and there is also some coverage
Simultaneously
from there.
in India?
Yes.
I mean, this when you look at Facebook's biggest market, I mentioned this in the States as well. You know, India is the top in terms of numbers of users, and obviously that's a country where, you know, which is rife with political discord and opportunities for destabilization. So that
They've worked extensively in India. They have an office in India.
I think that's something we might want to pursue later. But just on this point, when you were told that there was a vacancy because your predecessor died in Kenya, what explanation did the company give to you of that death?
Just to clarify, when I got hired, I wasn't told that my predecessor died in Kenya in his hotel room. That was several months after, when I asked about who was I actually replacing, because I was looking for some old files and I couldn't find. So I did realize that I didn't actually know the name of the person who I replaced. So I asked about, looking through old files, that's where it came out that he died.
So same question 2 months on then. What explanation were you given of the? How old was he? Do you know?
He was in his 30s.
Did they give you an explanation?
I mean, they did. Just if I explain it, just if you understand that it's pure speculation. So
Sure.
it's not. I'm not stating this as a matter of fact. I'm just repeating, what I heard. What I heard was that he was working on some kind of deal of some sort. I'm not sure exactly what kind of deal it is, but when you work for senior politicians in a lot of these countries, you don't actually make money in the electoral work. You make money in the influence brokering, after the fact. And that a deal went sour. And again, this is what I've been told, so I'm not saying this as a matter of fact, but people suspected that he was poisoned in his hotel room. I also heard that the police got bribed to not enter the hotel room for 24 hours. But that is what I was told. I wasn't there, so I can't, speak to the veracity of that account. But that's what I was told. Okay,
well, we'll leave that there for the moment because there are plenty of journalists who might want to follow some of those interesting leads. One of the things that as Mr. Nix was at pains to stress when he was in front of us was that there were different companies, different entities. Data could go one way but not another way because of government contracting. But there was one name that came up as the data control that was common between Cambridge Analytica and SCL, just almost demonstrating that there were common personnel, notwithstanding the denials. Was a lady called Jordana Zeta. Do you know her?
I do not.
No.
So
it's just a name.
It's just a name, but they do put lots of random names on all kinds of things.
Okay. There's also we've just been. I don't know whether you've seen that, which is a pictogram of the SCL structure. It's
sure.
Been done by an independent journalist, and it's just from filings at Companies House and
sure.
So it's fairly standard, but it's fairly complicated for a relatively
I'd
small
wager
company.
that there's probably more companies than even what's on that piece of paper.
But there are some interesting sort of names that crop up. Mr. Nix we know about. Sort of Etonian salesman, I think you almost described him as.
I mean, he my understanding is that the reason why Alexander Nix was involved in SCL was because his father had shares in the company and his father died. He inherited shares, or there was some deal that was done because he has no background in psychology, tech, politics, any of the things that they operate in. which is why he's a salesman. He likes to sell stuff.
And while I was cooking Sunday lunch this weekend, I listened to a BBC profile of Nigel Oakes.
Right.
Did you come across him?
Yes, although not day to day. So when we were setting up Cambridge Analytica, the reason why one of the reasons why SCL Elections, rather than either the group company or another entity, was the minority shareholder, was because Alexander Nix wanted to keep more control for himself, and he was quite paranoid about some of the other shareholders and directors in the group company. So he made a concerted effort to sort of keep this project away from the others as long as possible. But I did come across him several times. It's just what I'm saying is that it wasn't day to day. I didn't work with
Nigel Oakes. Mr. Oakes came across as a founding eminence grise.
Sorry?
From this profile, Mr. Oakes came across as the founding eminence grise behind the whole of the whole project.
No, not for Cambridge Analytica. For SCL, yes,
For SCL.
but not for Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon, Robert Mercer, and Alexander Nix. Most of those negotiations happened in America. They kept it pretty separate from the sort of legacy shareholders and directors of SCL. Okay. But he played a pivotal role in actually setting up SCL Group. Can I just throw
the role of a couple of other people? The role of the chairman, Julian Wheatland, and Victor Cengiz.
Which they got rid of Cengiz when they were finalizing the Cambridge Analytica deal, because the Mercer lawyers didn't like Cengiz's involvement, because apparently he had fairly sketchy business dealings that they didn't want to be associated with.
Okay. And Julian Wheatland, what was his role?
He was, I believe, the chairman. So he didn't sort of do much. He sort of was like the queen of the company, if that makes sense.
So you
not to say that the queen doesn't do a lot. I don't interpret that as a slight of it.
Mean head, sort of.
I'm just putting these other names up in because there's a danger that one focuses just on Mr. Nix, who's got a very sinister surname.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys, their role is not actually to do work; it's to do deals. Right, so they don't actually do anything day to day. They're the ones who, because of their family or because of their businesses or what have you, just have a very wide network of people, not just here in the UK, but in particular in Africa and various developing countries that enable the company to go and get working contracts. So their roles were usually like as the introducer, as the deal maker, not managing the day-to-day operations of the company.
Would you characterize them as people who wanted to make a fortune out of this, or people who were genuinely curious about the ability through social media in the digital age for them to be able to manipulate outcomes in politics?
You have to remember that a lot of these people are very wealthy already, so it's not Alexander Nix in particular, right? There was one time where he had to go, and we were running late because he had to pick up a 200,000 pound chandelier. So he there's these are people who don't need to make a lot of money, but the thing that I learned is that for certain wealthy people, they need something to keep them occupied, and they need projects. And going into the developing world and sort of running a country is something that appeals to them.
Okay, and I've just got one last question.
Sorry, I didn't mean that in a flippant way. If that came across as flippant, sorry.
This chart has got no mention of Aggregate IQ or SCL Canada as it styled itself. So what's the relationship between that Canadian company and the rest of this group?
Yeah. So very shortly after I became research director at SCL, and I was sort of given the directive or the mandate to expand the company's software capacity and technological infrastructure, we obviously needed people to do that. So I reached out to people who had worked on previous projects with, who I respected. One of those people was Jeff Sylvester, who is now the CTO of Aggregate IQ. So in the first email that I sent, which I've also passed on to the committee, I've passed on several folders of documents. The first email where I tell Jeff that I've just become research director, this is what we do, his immediate reaction is, you need a Canadian office. So he replied, you need a Canadian office. When I went to Alexander Nix and I said, there's a couple Canadians that I want to hire, he said, fine, but they have to come here and work in London. So when I talked with Jeff and several other people who then later became AIQ, they had new families, just got a house. It's not easy to just get up and move to a different country when you have young kids, right? So I went back to Alexander and said, look, they're not mobile, but I think they'd be really helpful because they're really good at what they do. So the compromise was that a Canadian company would be set up that would enable the Canadians who wanted to work on the projects, and keep in mind at the time this is SCL, this is before Cambridge Analytica got set up. So primarily we were focused on projects in the developing world. But the deal was that they would sign an intellectual property license whereby all of the work that they were doing for the company would then be assigned to SCL Group, and that they would trade as SCL Canada, but they set up a Canadian entity, and that the legal name was Aggregate IQ. That was also in part because, when you work in a lot of countries, sometimes it's beneficial to have different, billing names on invoices, and if you're working in a country that has declarable expenses and all of that, sure, you can particularly if you're trying to get around coordination rules, like in the United States, which have very strict non-coordination rules, if you can actually bill as several different companies, but it's the same team working on it, the paperwork looks compliant, even if the project isn't.
So it's a Canadian-based shell company, effectively.
Yeah, I would sort of call it like a franchise, as it were. So in internal staff documents, so for example, this internal staff list, which I've also passed on to the committee, AIQ staff are listed under SCL Canada. So the internal documents of the company refer to this entity, AIQ, as SCL Canada. As I've been saying for months now, but as has now been validated yesterday by Gizmodo, which is a website that has actually found the code base that AIQ built that shows that AIQ actually built the Ripon platform for Cambridge Analytica. So there's now tangible proof in the public domain that AIQ actually built Ripon, which is the software that utilized the algorithms from the Facebook data. I could talk more about some of the other projects that AIQ has worked on. So for example, Nigeria, the Nigerian project in 2015, that Carol at The Guardian has touched on in her reporting, where the company utilized the services of an Israeli private intelligence firm. That firm is Black Cube. That's not being reported, although Channel 4 has undercover footage that they haven't been able to put into the public domain of Alexander Nix talking about the relationship with Black Cube. Black Cube on the Nigeria project was engaged to hack the now president of Nigeria, Buhari, to get access to his medical records and private emails. AIQ worked on that project. So Aggregate IQ was was handed material in Nigeria from Cambridge Analytica to distribute online. So that's distribution of compromat, and that's also distribution of incredibly threatening and violent video content, which I've also passed on to the committee. The videos that AIQ distributed in Nigeria with the sole intent of intimidating voters included content where people were being dismembered, where people were having their throats cut and bled to death in a ditch. They were being burned alive. There's incredibly anti-Islamic and threatening messages portraying Muslims as violent, and this is, again, so you've got Aggregate IQ, which received 40% of Vote Leave's funding, also working on projects that involved hacked material and compromat and distributing violent videos of people being bled to death to intimidate voters. And this is the company that played an incredibly pivotal role in politics here. So something that I would strongly recommend to the committee is that they actually, not only push the authorities here, but really give them, the support that they need in order to actually investigate this company and what they were doing in Brexit.
I've just got one final question because my colleague Julie Elliott wanted to come in. Most of the reporting here has been focused on the Cambridge Analytica link or lack of link with leave.eu, rather than it or its entities links with Vote Leave, both from the Vote Leave campaign and also the money that's been diverted off to Believe. Mm-hmm. The other focus of reporting has been the number of the amount of Facebook data that's been collected through Alexander Kogan's activities, which mostly seems to relate to the States. But clearly the question underlying all this is if you're going to spend such a lot of money trying to influence the UK referendum, then to be able to try and do that, you have to have a set of data on lots of UK individuals to make it worth people's while spending the money with you. So I hope that is the extent of the UK data that's held by Cambridge Analytica and its affiliates and associates might come out in this session.
One of the things that I've also passed on to the committee is some of the contractual documentation and emails from some of AIQ's past projects. One of them was for the at the time the Minister of National Security of Trinidad. In the contractual documents and then also email chains, AIQ, part of the project was to go out and find a way of accessing raw internet service provider data for the entire country to monitor what people were browsing in that country. As I understand it, that's not legal in Trinidad. It certainly wouldn't be legal here. But the thing that I would say is that Aggregate IQ, in part because it was set up and works within the auspices of Cambridge Analytica, inherited a lot of the company culture of total disregard for the law. And so I would, again, strongly encourage actually looking at, this question of where did they get the data? When I met with Don Cummings in November 2015, one of the things that was apparent is that Vote Leave at the time actually didn't have any data. So to go, and that's in November 2015. So, and Don Cummings, in part, wanted to meet with me because he was really interested in Cambridge Analytica. He also said that he wanted to create the quote-unquote Palantir for politics, and but it became apparent that it's like, well, if you don't even have the electoral register, let alone a social database, you can't really do this, or you can't really do this legally. Very shortly after that meeting, they then engage AIQ. I think in part, although this bit is me speculating, I think in part because they couldn't. It would look odd if Leave EU was working with Cambridge Analytica and Vote Leave was working with Cambridge Analytica. But you could get the next best thing, which is a company that can do virtually everything that CA can do, but with a different, billing name for your invoices. But my question is, where did you get the data? Because how do you create a massive targeting operation in a country that AIQ hadn't previously worked in 2 months? It baffles me as to how that could happen in such a short amount of time. So that's a good question. It's unfortunate that AIQ hides behind jurisdictional barriers and doesn't actually come here and answer those questions. But it is something that hopefully can be looked at. So how did it actually work? This is a company that has worked with hacked material, right? This is a company that will send out videos of people being murdered to intimidate voters. This is a company that goes out and tries to illicitly acquire, live internet browsing data of everyone in an entire country. So I think a lot of questions should be asked about the role of Aggregate IQ in this election and whether they were indeed actually compliant with the law here, beyond just suspending infractions.
Thank you. I understand that quite a few colleagues want to come in on this particular point. If I could just say for the record of people following the proceedings, Chris Wylie has given the committee access to a large number of documents that he has. We received those this morning, and we will be looking to go through those and discuss those with him, with a view to publishing some of those documents probably tomorrow, but certainly as soon as we can practically go through them and look through them. Can I just ask, the allegations you make about AIQ and Nigeria are very serious. The documents and the folders you've given us, they provide evidence to support that allegation.
So you have the video, one of the videos that I'm referring to, and I'd recommend following Carol's reporting on the matter, because she's done a ton of work on researching it, and she's actually published some articles on the Nigeria hacking scheme also. But AIQ was involved in the Nigeria project. Both as the company and then several people also individually who all also frequently work at AIQ.
Yeah, thank you. So, Julian, Ian. Okay.
Can I just ask a very short question? I just want to put to you, Mr. Wylie, a statement that was made by Aggregate IQ on their website on Saturday the 24th of March 2018.
Sure.
They said, Aggregate IQ is a digital advertising, web and software development company based in Canada. It is and has always been 100% Canadian owned and operated. Aggregate IQ has never been and is not a part of Cambridge Analytica or SCL. What is your reaction to that statement?
They're using weasel words. So that is all technically true.
Yeah.
Okay, but let me be super clear. Okay, so they are based in Canada. That is true. They are a Canadian company. That is true. They are not owned, but they have licensed their intellectual property, right? Secondly, the basis of the software of Cambridge Analytica, right? So for example, the Ripon project, they built that. They operate as an internal entity. They're kept at an arm's length in part because that was useful for particularly American projects where you need different entities to work on campaigns and PACs and various other entities where you can't coordinate. But if you have different companies, you can, the paperwork looks appropriate and the paperwork looks compliant, even if, behind the scenes you're talking back and forth and using the same underlying technology. They built Ripon. Ripon was the software that these algorithms went into that then deployed the data to target. The actual sort of advertising deployment was on them. That's what they did. So it's fine and dandy for them to say, we're a Canadian company. That's true. But if you sort of unmask what they actually do and look at how they actually operate and the projects that they've actually worked on, the overwhelming majority of those projects and the overwhelming majority of their income came from Cambridge Analytica and SCL.
Are you in a position to say definitively today that Cambridge Analytica shared its data with AIQ?
It depends on what you mean by its data. So
shared any data?
Yes, absolutely. You can't create software that deploys adverts or targets people online or has a front-end interface for you to query data without actually accessing the data itself, right? You can't have targeting software that doesn't access the database, right? So CA would have the database, Cambridge Analytica or AIQ would be able to access that because otherwise the software doesn't work. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. We have evidence now that Facebook data was used by Cambridge Analytica, and I think it's accepted even by Facebook that information was unlawfully transferred to Cambridge Analytica. Can you say that AIQ had access to that data?
Yes, because that's what the Ripon software and the Ripon project was. The modeling of that Facebook data amongst other data sets, and then the deployment of that data in online targeting and various other political projects, and it was Aggregate IQ that actually built the software for that. And so I provided documents in terms of the what I provided to the committee is the contractual documents for that and the IP licensing for that. But yesterday, the website Gizmodo actually has found a lot of the actual underlying code with the software development comments, between AIQ and SCL developers. So not only do you have access to the contractual documents which I provided to the committee, but also if you look at what Gizmodo is reporting, you can actually see the code.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think if you don't mind. I think Rebecca's got one quick question on this point, if you don't mind, then we'll come on to you.
Thank you for that. What I was actually going to ask it. I was so interested in you saying earlier, where did they get the data from? And I just wanted to get this sort of on the record because we had Alexander Nix here, and I asked him about whether they'd used Facebook data, and he categorically said, we don't work with Facebook, we do not have Facebook data, but we do use it as a platform to advertise, we do gather data from Facebook, and we do surveys. So
we don't have Facebook data, but we gather Facebook data.
So what would you say to that? Do you, just on the record, do you think that was just absolutely a lie, that in fact they did have Facebook data, they were gathering it, they were using it? And on the back of that, if we have this link between Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ, of which Robert Mercer owns the company, surely they must be using the data.
So, to address your first point, it is categorically untrue that Cambridge Analytica has never used Facebook data. Facebook data and the acquisition using Alexander Kogan's app was the foundational data set of the company. That is how the algorithms were developed. They spent $1 million at least on that acquisition project. And so for him, and by the way, what I've provided to the committee is the signed contracts, okay, with Alexander Kogan's signature and Alexander Nix's signature on a contract that references using an app that harvests Facebook data and the friend network data also.
So they've led us up the garden path for a long time, and now we're getting to the bottom of it.
I think Alexander Nix's comments to your committee were exceptionally misleading. And frankly, I would say not only misleading, but I think they were dishonest.
Thank you. Julia.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, if I may. There's also been on YouTube, on the public record in a way, for a long time, 2 videos from 2015 where you see interns, at least one of the videos, you see an intern that was working at Cambridge Analytica that was describing his work in a public forum. His work using Facebook likes to model psychographics. and he's describing his work at Cambridge Analytica. When the Guardian contacted Cambridge Analytica, the video was removed, even though it was controlled by a different entity called ASI Data Science. So I had managed to download that video, so I have it, and I put it on the record.
And by the way, ASI Data Science also worked for Vote Leave. And ASI was one of the subcontractors to Cambridge Analytica, and they provided a lot of the data scientists that Cambridge Analytica used to do their modeling work. So Vote Leave used Aggregate IQ. They also used ASI. Their Chief Technology Officer, Tom Borick, also worked on projects for SCL Group in Trinidad and Antigua. So I think, more broadly, a question should be asked is why is it that all these entities were being used? Given that Dom Cummings was very interested in Cambridge Analytica, and not only Cambridge Analytica, but more broadly, Robert Mercer's work in Renaissance Technologies, which is his hedge fund. What did Dom Cummings know, and why is it that he was using Aggregate IQ and ASI Data Science? Why is it that their CTO was also somebody who ran projects for SCL Group around the world? I mean, these are, and to her credit, Carol at The Guardian has been raising these questions for a year now. So I think it would be appropriate for your committee and other committees to start raising those questions also. What was happening inside of Vote Leave, and why were these companies chosen?
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and quite a lot of the things that I've asked have come out, was wanting to ask, have come out in evidence, but it sounds to me as if all of these different names of things are to just try and confuse what on earth's going on here. Not by you, but by the companies, the way they've been set up. If AIQ, they were being paid for work for the Vote Leave campaign and others, do you think they were working to a common plan for paid work to get a common result? Or do you think they were all been working separately?
I know that, before I answer, are you referring to, which common plan are you referring to before I answer?
For the various leave campaigns, right. Which was to get a leave result in the referendum.
So let me first say, it's just, I supported leave. Despite having pink hair and a nose ring, I'm one of the rare breeds of progressive Eurosceptics. I don't believe in the current Brexit plan, so just to clarify, but I do speak as somebody who, for me this is not about remain or leave, this is about the integrity of the democratic process, which is more important than anything else. Okay, so I just want to preface what I say. I am absolutely convinced that there was a common plan and common purpose with Vote Leave, Be Leave, the DUP, and Veterans for Britain. All of these companies somehow, for some reason, all decided to use Aggregate IQ as their primary service provider when Aggregate IQ did not have any public presence, no media, no website. The only way that you could find them on the internet is if you went to SCL's website and called up SCL Canada, right? So first question that I have is, why is it that all of a sudden this company that has never worked on anything but Cambridge Analytica projects, that had no public presence, somehow became the primary service provider to all of these supposedly independent and different campaign groups, firstly. And secondly, what I've provided to the Electoral Commission is 3 binders of evidence about this high, of emails, documents, invoices, chat logs, activity logs, system logs, screen caps of conversations that were happening inside of Vote Leave, in particular with reference to the Be Leave project, which was the single largest expenditure of Vote Leave, went to Be Leave. And when you look at the accumulation of evidence, I think it would be completely unreasonable to come to any other conclusion that this must be coordination, this must be a common purpose plan. When I went to Aggregate IQ's office, because I was, after BuzzFeed released their first article on "Isn't it bizarre that a fashion student who is 22 received, £625,000 in the last 2 weeks of the referendum, and isn't it weird that this Canadian company that no one's ever heard of received 40% of Leave spending?" And having introduced Darren and Shamir to Vote Leave and having set up this company, I was genuinely concerned that that something unlawful happened. I mean, it doesn't pass the smell test. And when I went and actually spoke to Aggregate IQ, who were very, very pleased with themselves as how that project went, understandably they won. But I asked them. I said, "Well, can you show me actually what it is that you were doing? What was your secret? How did you And he's how did you win? What did you do?" And they conceded to me, and this is a verbatim quote, which and I stand by. I remember Jeff Sylvester telling me this. It was, quote, "totally illegal." But they found it amusing because you have to remember that this is a company that has gone around the world and undermined democratic institutions in all kinds of countries, right? They could care less as to whether or not their work is compliant because they like to win. And when I asked them, okay, show me some of the work that you've done, I asked them, did you silo the data? Did you silo your advertising? If you're doing programmatic advertising, if you don't silo your programs into different campaigns, the results of one campaign will influence the results of the other campaign. And they said, absolutely not. It was all just one common ad program, which means that Aggregate IQ was just used as a proxy money laundering vehicle, right? What Dom Cummings did is he went around and found places that he could just launder money through to give it to AIQ so that they could overspend. And that is my genuinely held belief. And for me, it makes me so angry because a lot of people supported Leave because they believe in the application of British law and British sovereignty, and to irrevocably alter the constitutional settlement of this country on fraud is a mutilation of the constitutional settlement of this country. And you cannot call yourself a leaver. You cannot call yourself somebody who believes in British law and win by breaking British law in order to achieve that goal.
And is that your belief as well, that the law was broken in this?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I am so angry that that two people that I introduced in good faith that it's hard for a lot of young people to get involved in politics. And I introduced these two young people to volunteer on a campaign to Stephen Parkinson in good faith that that they wouldn't be manipulated and they wouldn't be used to break the law. And what is so egregious about this is that Darren was made to be personally liable for a criminal conspiracy, in my view. And it is absolutely outrageous that he has the amount of emotional trauma that Darren has been put through. Watching his mental health deteriorate, watching that Dom Cummings and Matthew Elliott encouraged him and eventually convinced him to quit university so that he could stay at Brexit Central, right? And when I talked to Darren and I said, I think that you should get out of this because I think you are losing your perspective as to what's happening. And I told him that I thought that he was being manipulated, particularly after all of this stuff came out. And he said, well, I've already quit university because they told me to quit university. And what am I going to do? I have no options. Everyone hates me. He told me that he felt trapped, and part of the reason why I'm speaking out, and part of the reason why Shamir is speaking out is in large part, irrespective of what you think about Darren's political stance on things, he was a young person that was manipulated and continues to be manipulated in my view. And what is so outrageous is that he is the one who is legally liable. He is the one being investigated. It's not Dom Cummings being investigated. It's not Stephen Parkinson being investigated. It's not Cleo Watson, also at Downing Street, being investigated. She was head of outreach. She was in charge of this program. It's not Victoria Woodcock, who went after being notified, 2 weeks after being notified that she was under investigation. She goes onto this shared drive where they were putting all of their advertising, putting all of their materials, and she goes and attempts to delete Dom Cummings, herself, and Henry DeZoot, the head of Digital Vote Leave, after they were being notified that they were under investigation, right? And it's not them that's being investigated, it's Darren, the 22-year-old intern, who had no control over that spending and was just told, sign here, sign here.
Do you think these people that you've mentioned, not Darren, the other people that you've mentioned there, knew what they were doing, knew that what they were doing was in breach of the law?
So, Vote Leave's lawyers, William Norton, wrote the Constitution for Believe. The entire process was managed by Vote Leave's lawyers. So Believe was set up by Vote Leave's lawyers. The entire process was managed by Vote Leave's lawyers. And as Shamir has commented on before, that created a veneer or a sort of a sense that that what Believe was doing, or what these two young people were doing, felt legal because they kept talking to the lawyers who kept telling them to do this and that. So they just assumed that, well, if the Vote Leave lawyers are telling us to do this, that therefore this must be the proper way to do it. This was their first campaign, right? They were volunteers. So I don't, although Darren is technically legally liable for what happened, morally I don't fault him.